Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 3, Halacha 1. This is part 1 of the shiur. This will be a two-part shiur. In the art scroll, we're on 25b3. Today, we're getting into the topic of what about truma, something that was designated as truma, but now you found out that it was ruined. Now, that's going to have a lot of implications. So, for instance, let's say you separated something and you found out it was spoiled. Well, the idea is that maybe this was spoiled before you actually separated truma, and then you didn't really separate truma because you're supposed to be separating from the best. You're not supposed to be separating spoiled food. So, if that was the case, then it's not really truma, and the pile that you have is still going to be tevel. And what about if it's spoiled after you separate it? In other words, you have this food that is now spoiled, and you say, oh, well, maybe it's spoiled now, but the rest of it's good. Well, that's going to be where, that's still going to be okay. Like you still separated it, right? But now there's a suffix, and that's really what the issue is, because you're not 100% sure that this food was really in the best order when you separated it. And so they're going to make you separate it again, and it's still going to have issues where, like, the Kohanim can't eat this second separation. And the reason that we're being stringent on this is because we're not sure that you separated the truma. And so there is an issue that if it was already spoiled when you separated it, it's not truma, and then the pile that you have there is tevel. And if the pile is tevel, you can't eat it. So it's going to be stringent. So the Mishnah starts off and it says, if someone separates a chait melon as truma for other chait melons, and it is later found to be bitter, or he separates a watermelon as truma for other watermelons, and it is later found to be spoiled, the portion he separated is treated as valid truma, but he must nevertheless separate truma again in order to permit the remaining produce. Now, by the way, a chait melon is a melon that you can still once in a while find in the markets here in the Middle East, and it's a very bland, light type of melon. It's not really a zucchini. It looks like a cucumber, and it's sometimes you find it. It's called a cucumis chait. That's the Latin name for it. Anyway, normally they're not going to be. Normally they're going to be bland. So if you're finding something that's going to be very bitter, well, that's not. That's going to be considered spoiled. Now, there's a type of melon in Asia that's called a bitter melon, and it is very, very bitter. And in fact, it's so bitter you have to cook it. So, in thinking about how bitter it could get quite bitter. Anyway, we also see about the watermelons. What if this one watermelon you separated out was spoiled? And it doesn't mean that the other watermelons are spoiled, but you can't just go ahead and use the other watermelons. You have to go separate out again. And the worry is that when this was separated out as truma and now you found it was spoiled or bitter, the possibility is that at the time you designated it, it was inedible. And then because it's inedible, you can't use it as truma. And you can't use that spoiled watermelon as truma on behalf of other watermelons, for example. So because of the uncertainty of this, you have to act stringently. And that's, going to include that, non-Kohanim can't eat it, only Kohanim can eat it. And also, in order for this designation, it might have been effective, but at the same time, the rest of the produce remains forbidden as tevel until you take out that additional truma portion again. And from there, the idea is that, well, maybe this original truma designation was not effective. And so, you have this idea that, on one hand, if we're going to say the designated portion has not yet become truma, that would mean that the remaining produce is still tevel.
And if you say that the remaining produce has been rectified, then the designated portion would necessarily be truma. And since possible leniencies are mutually exclusive, we can't adopt either one of them. Therefore, it has to be a stringent ruling. And then there's a similar ruling, and the Mishnah says that if someone separates a barrel of wine as truma for other wine, and it is found to be vinegar, the law is as follows: that if it is now known that which he designated was already vinegar when he separated the truma, it is not a valid truma. And in other words, the Tana of this Mishnah holds that wine and vinegar are regarded as two separate species. That, by the way, is what Rebbe says, and that is what's going to prevent them from serving as truma for each other. And so it continues and it says, if, however, we see that it's soured only after it was separated as truma, it's valid truma. And in other words, he took out the wine, and the souring of the wine does not retroactively invalidate the designation. And it says in the Mishnah, and if there's a doubt as to when it became vinegar, the designated portion is treated as valid truma. But nevertheless, he must designate the truma again to permit the remaining wine. So if you can't figure out whether the wine soured before or after the truma was separated, the designation has a suffix. It lays in doubt. So you're required to act stringently in this, just like in the case of the watermelons. And the idea is that the vinegar is subject to the laws that govern actual truma, since the designation maybe was valid. So then the remaining wine has to be treated like tevel until truma is separated again from it. And since the original truma designation, maybe it wasn't, maybe it did not take effect. So a Kohen who's given these two trumas may not use the first one, the vinegar, because if it had already been vinegar at the time of separation, it would not be truma, it would just be tevel. And the second truma portion, since it's wine, could not rectify this vinegar from the first quote-unquote truma that he has. So the Kohen has to designate some of the vinegar in this first batch as truma in order to remove the possible tevel status from the vinegar. In other words, the first, when the Kohen gets it, right, you have to give the Kohen two batches of truma. And the first one is going to be vinegar. Second one's wine. Second one, that's fine. But the first one, he can't just consume it. He can't just, put it on his salad. Why can't he just put it on his salad? Because it might be tevel, and a Kohen is not allowed to eat tevel either. So he himself, in order to rectify it, has to take out truma from it as well. So the Mishnah now goes to some halachic consequences that come as a result of this suffix status of these two trumas. And so it says the first truma does not render the other produce a meduma, in other words, a forbidden mixture of truma and chulin on its own. In other words, according to biblical law, if you have forbidden food such as a truma, and which may not be eaten by non-kohanim, and it becomes mixed up with a permitted food of the same species, the forbidden food is nullified and the mixture is permitted, as long as the permitted food constitutes the majority of the mixture. But there's a rabbinic decree that the mixture of truma and chulin is forbidden to a non-kohen unless the mixture contains at least 100 parts of chulin. That's going to be produce that has already been rectified for 1 part of truma. So if a mixture contains an amount of truma in excess of this ratio, the nullification doesn't take place. And in such a mixture, it's referred to as a meduma. And the proceeding does not apply to the questionable truma in our Mishnah's case, and a simple majority of chulin is going to be enough to nullify this truma and permit it to a non-kohen. So the owner, he still has to give it to a kohen, and he still has to give a portion of the mixture equivalent to the truma component. That's what the Rambam says. So the halacha requires that whenever truma is nullified in chulin, and the idea is that this leniency is a consequence of this questionable status of truma. And so if you have a mixture containing less than 100 parts chulin for 1 part of truma, it's only rabbinically forbidden. And this leniency is unique to cases involving questionable truma, because as a general rule, an item that's subject to an uncertainty on the biblical level is going to be treated stringently, even with regard to application of rabbinic law. It's not subject to the penalty of the additional fifth for accidentally eating it. Ordinarily, if a non-Kohen inadvertently eats truma, he has to separate a quantity of produce equivalent to what he ate, plus a 25% surcharge, which is going to be an additional fifth, and give it to the Kohen. And the idea is that both the principle and the surcharge are imbued with truma sanctity, but once this mission is teaching that if a non-Kohen eats questionable truma, he's required only to separate the principle. He doesn't have to give the additional fifth. Again, this truma might or might not be truma. It's a suffix, and we just don't know. The Mishnah now says that, and so too with regard to the second truma. So, in other words, the second truma is also subject to the same leniency as the first one, since also that status is questionable as well. So, one of these for sure is real truma. We just don't know which one. And you could always say, oh, well, it was that one, or you could say it was this one. So, unless you can know for sure, both are going to be treated as suffix. But one for sure is real, right? One really is the truma. We just don't know which one it is. So the Mishnah now talks about more details about how these questionable truma portions affect a mixture with chulin, because again, it might not actually be a truma mixture. Now, normally when a truma mixture falls into something, you know that truma for sure is definite truma, and this chulin is definite chulin. In other words, the chulin's already been rectified. It's already had the truma taken out of it. It's not tevel. But now if something falls into it, either one of these two trumas, where it's both suffix, you're not sure, it might be, it might not be, it's 50% chance that it is, well, it's not going to have the same set of law. So the Mishnah says that if one of these two trumas fell into chulin, it does not render the chulin a forbidden meduma mixture. In other words, that the statement is essentially a reiteration of what we just said. But the point is that either one of these, if it fell in, is going to be questionable. Now, the idea is that this law is repeated here to introduce the next case in which both of these two trumas fell in. So again, one of these for sure is truma. So the last case that we just talked about in the Mishnah is going to be where one of these suffix trumas fell in, and it's only 50% doubt that it's truma. But this is now going to be talking about what if both of them fell in. So one of them is not, and one of them is. We just don't know which one is. So it says if the second one fell into a different place into the chulin, in other words, a different location, it does not render that chulin a forbidden meduma mixture. But if both trumas fell into one place, in other words, into the same container of chulin, in this basically the same area, they render the chulin a forbidden meduma mixture according to the size of the smaller of the two portions. So the idea is that if the first truma and the second truma, so let's say it would be vinegar and wine, right? Both fell into the same barrel of chulin. Then the special ratio that is required to nullify mixtures of truma and chulin does apply, because the mixture actually does have truma in it. It's either going to be the portion that's vinegar or it's going to be the portion that's wine. We just don't know which one. But we do not require 100 times more chulin than both the trumas together, since only one of these is actually going to be truma. So the mixture is going to be permitted as long as it has 100 times more chulin than the smaller of the two trumas. So the idea is that this 100-to-1 ratio is rabbinic, and the question of which truma needs 100 parts chulin is going to be decided leniently. And similarly, the earlier ruling that the non-Kohen who eats one of the questionable trumas is exempt from the surcharge of the additional fifth does not apply to one who ate both trumas, since he certainly ate one of them. One of them is for real a truma. So this is talking about if both of them fell into the same area. In other words, they're both consumed by being put into the part falling into the hole and being absorbed into the hole. Well, for sure, the real truma fell into it. Likewise, in the last case, if somebody came and ate both of them at the same time, he for sure ate the truma. We just don't know which one he was the truma. So that ruling in the last case would only be with eating. If he ate both of it, would be where he would have to pay one surcharge, but that surcharge would be based on only one of the trumas, not both of the trumas. So you'd basically calculate what was the size of the truma that was there, and then you'd add 25%, and he would have to pay that. So then it says that if the second one fell into a different place or into other hulin, it does not render that hulin a forbidden meduma mixture. And if both trumas fell into one place, into the same container, they render the hulin forbidden according to the size of the smaller. So, in other words, if the hulin falls into two different containers, the truma falls into two different containers. You have two trumas, and one falls into this side and one falls into that side, and they're separated. Well, this one here is not a meduma because you might say, well, it's the one over there. And regarding the one over there, you might say, well, it's the one over here. So this only comes about if it falls into the same location. That's what the Mishnah is trying to say. Let's get into a little bit of the Gemara. And it says, regarding what the Mishnah was talking about, if somebody separates a chait melon as truma and it's found to be bitter, or watermelon is found to be spoiled, that is truma, but he has to separate truma again. And the Gemara is going to raise a question. The Mishnah's ruling, says this Gemara, is understandable in the later case where somebody separated a watermelon as truma and is found to be spoiled. And in that instance, since the watermelon might have been edible at the time it was separated, you have to treat it as possible truma. And the additional truma needs to be separated just in case the first truma had already been spoiled at the time of being separated. So produce that's spoiled to the degree that is unfit for human consumption, by the way, is not liable to truma. We saw that, by the way, in the Mishnah in chapter 2. And therefore, if it's already spoiled to the degree you can't eat it, it can't be designated for truma on behalf of other produce. So if it's known what the watermelon designation as truma would be when it was spoiled, then it would be for sure it's an invalid truma separation. But that's not what chapter 3 halacha 1 is dealing with, right? We're dealing with something where you only now found out later after the fact that this is a spoiled watermelon, and you just don't know if it's spoiled before you separated it, which means it's not a valid separation, or after you separated it. So the Gemara is going to be saying that in the case where somebody separated a chait melon as truma and is now found to be bitter, the Mishnah's ruling is difficult because was not the chait melon bitter from the start? In other words, it's easy to understand from the watermelon being spoiled, but now you're talking about produce that is going to be undesirable, like bitter. And now we're going to get into a whole dialogue about chait melons maybe being bitter from the beginning, or maybe that's the nature of it. And, that's going to be, whether this should really be, questionable truma or even tevel. So as a rule, chait melons do not develop a bitter flavor over time. This is what the Rosh Cirilio says. And if one is found to be bitter, it's most likely always bitter and going to be, you're going to assume that it's inedible. So if the original truma designation was, made on this bitter one that was bitter from the start, then it was invalid from the start. And then the first truma should not be considered truma at all. That's the idea. So the Gemara is going to answer this. And Rabbi Yochanan said that the rabbis treated these bitter chait melons as questionable food. In other words, there's a doubt whether a bitter chait melon is going to be considered food at all. And because of this uncertainty, the original truma designation should be possibly valid truma. So if it definitely was, not considered to be food, then, certainly it's not valid truma because it's not food. You can only separate truma on food. But there's a doubt as to whether this is going to be considered to be edible or food. So while an additional portion, needs to be separated in the case of the first portion, it does not qualify as edible food. So, in other words, in this case, we're not concerned about when the chait melon became bitter because it was already bitter. Really, the uncertainty is whether this chait melon is going to qualify as food in the first place. And if it does not qualify as food, then you don't obligate it in tithes, and then it's not going to be truma. And if the bitter chait melon is not legally regarded as food, it's exempt from tithes. It can't serve as truma. If it is going to be, then you just didn't take from the best of it, right? You always have to take from the best, and ideally, you don't really want to eat bitter chait melons, I guess. So then if it is going to be regarded as food, then you have to separate again because you just didn't pick the right one. So that's going to be the uncertainty about whether this is going to be food, and they want to look at other areas of halacha as well. Rabbi Yonah inquired and said, did the rabbis treat bitter chait melons as questionable food with regards to other matters, or only with regards to truma is it going to be possibly inedible? Rabbi Yonah specifies a number of cases in which this issue is relevant. And by the way, this comes up in Masechet Shvius. You have inferior types of produce that are not like garden produce, but they have this inferior produce that grows out in the wilderness. You can find a lot of these over in the Jerusalem forest. And these ones that in Masechet Shvius it talks about will be regarded as bitter. And there's also a question over there as whether it's going to be regarded as food as well. So you can see this coming up also in Masechet Shvius. So Rabbi Yonah specifies a number of cases in which this issue comes up and says if the bitter chait melon was designated as truma or touched a source of tuma, does it definitely contract tuma of foods? In other words, edible food can become tamei. So if a human corpse touches it, or the carcass of a sheretz touches it, but only food that's unfit for human consumption is not going to be susceptible to tuma. So the question here is if the bitter chait melon was able to become tamei, then you would say, oh, it's definitely food, right? So the Gemara says, does it contract the tuma of foods, and is one therefore obligated to burn it in a state of tuma, or does it contact tuma only out of doubt, and so it does not need to be burned? That's the question. So, if it's going to be considered definite food and thus definitely become tamei, we're obligated to burn it like any other truma that's tamei. But if the status of edible food is uncertain, would we be obligated to burn it or not? So the assumption here is that the obligation to burn truma that became tamei is maybe a rabbinic law, and in a situation of doubt, one could be lenient. So there's another question about this. It says, if a bitter chait melon was designated as truma, is a non-Kohen subject to the penalty of the additional fifth for accidentally eating it? So, as we explained earlier, a non-Kohen who accidentally consumes truma is required to give the additional fifth plus the original amount to a Kohen. And in the event that the consumed truma portion was going to be the bitter chait melon, if it's not food, then does he have to? He doesn't need to return a fifth, right? Because you'd say that it's not food. There's another case. It says if bitter chait melon was designated as Meiser Sheni, is subject to lashes for eating it outside the walls of Jerusalem. So Meiser Sheni is the second tithe taken from the produce of in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years in the Shemitah cycle, and it's brought to Jerusalem. It's eaten there, or you redeem it for money. But the question here is that if this is going to be regarded as food, and this was designated as Meiser Sheni, and now you ate it outside the walls of Jerusalem, well, if it's regarded as definite food, you get lashes, just like any other food. But if it's not regarded as food, you don't get lashes. So that's going to be the question. There's another question. It says, if one established the Ereve Tehumin with it, does he become comparable to a donkey driver who's also a camel driver? In other words, is he going to be confined by both the techum of his Erev and the techum of his original residence? So this is a little bit complicated, but the person is allowed to travel 2,000 amos in all directions from the place of where you are when Shabbat starts, and there's a mechanism that's going to be the techum, the Ereve Tehumim, and just the Erev, right? And basically, this is a way for you to also establish a new legal residence. So the idea is that you have to set up at this new residence some food. So if he used the bitter melon, is this also going to be counting as a place for you to go ahead and set up your Erev? But if it's not going to be, it's not going to count as an Erev. So Rabbi Yonah is inquiring that is a bitter chait melon considered definite food with regards to all matters not related to truma separation, in which case the Erev would be a fully valid Erev, or, says the Rosh Cirilio, Rabbi Yonah is implying, is the status of a bitter chait melon in doubt, so that the person who attempted to establish an Erev is still going to be restricted to the area of his original residence, because the Erev doesn't really count. So the Gemara now is going to present an additional ramification that emerges if the bitter chait melon is going to be universally considered questionable food. So the Gemara says that there's a different context. Rabbi Yochanan said concerning a loaf of bread that became tameh on account of doubt that arose in a private domain. In other words, that the loaf was deemed tameh due to the possibility that it touched a source of tuma in a private domain. And the Gemara says, and it subsequently touches another food in a public domain. Then the second item is likewise deemed tameh. And although uncertainties of tuma in a public domain are generally decided leniently in the case of a loaf that has already been established as tameh, but here, however, says this Gemara regarding the bitter chait melon, if it became subject to an uncertainty of tuma, even in a private domain, it remains tahor. Because of this situation, there are two doubts. First, whether the chait melon ever came in contact with the source of tuma, and second, whether the chait melon is going to be even regarded as food at all. So, as explained before, the principle here is going to be that, as a rule, the uncertainty regarding tuma is decided according to the domain where the question came up first. So an uncertainty of tuma that arises in a public domain is judged to be tahor, while one that arises in a private domain is judged to be tameh. And these rules are derived from the laws prescribed in the Torah in the case of the sota. So Rabbi Yochanan here is really going back to that to look at a case where a loaf of bread had presumably come in contact with a source of tuma in a private domain, so that's deemed to be tameh, and now the loaf touches a different food item in a public domain. So since the initial doubt whether or not the loaf came in contact with a source of tuma was already decided stringently, the loaf is now considered definitely tameh, and therefore the tuma carries over to the second loaf, even though the contact between them occurred in the public domain. So the idea is that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling with regard to the loaf of bread is whether an uncertainty of tuma arises in a private domain, and then the tuma is established as definite. And it would seem to follow that you have to act stringently even in the case where the fruit was possibly exposed to tuma, and then that would be the case of the bitter chait melon, because maybe you can't even eat it at all. That's also in doubt. So, for in this case of the certainty, the Gemara is teaching that in this instant the melon in fact remains completely tahor because the doubt relating to the edibility, and so you really have a double suffix question. So the Gemara is going to cite. So again, the question is whether it's going to be regarded as food, and this double suffix. So the Gemara is going to cite a Tana who disagrees with our Mishnah's ruling about the chait melon and whether it could be found as bitter or not. And there's a brisa that taught in the name of Rabbi Yosei that you will not have any bitter part of a chait melon except for the innermost section. In other words, what he is saying is that even when the chait melon is found to be bitter, it's only the inner part, and the outer part's always going to be edible. So then it says, how then should somebody act in the case where the chait melon is going to be that somebody designated as truma was found to be bitter? It said that he should add an appropriate measure from another one of the melons to the outer section that's considered to be valid truma, and designate that additional measure as truma to compensate for the bitter intersection of the original melon. In other words, that in Rabbi Yosei's view, you don't need to designate another full melon as truma because the outer section was always going to be okay, but it's the inner part that's not. So you have to take for the volume of the inner part that's not okay and substitute it with another part that's going to be from the outer part of the melon, from another melon, and that way you're adding them together where you're coming up to satisfy that and to sort of like erase the bitter part. So unlike Rabbi Yosei, our Mishnah is ruling that in the case of a chait melon, if it was found to be bitter, you have to separate an additional full melon as truma. So maybe it seems that the sages disagreed with Rabbi Yosei and maintained that a bitter chait melon is affected in the entirety. In other words, not just the inner part, and it could be the outer part as well. So Rabbi Binyamin Bar Levi asked and says, is it possible that something you can determine by simply tasting the outer section of a bitter chait melon is an issue over which the sages disagree with Rabbi Yosei? And in other words, can't this just be verified? And the Gemara explains the nature of the dispute. It says, rather, it is regarding the outcome of the very investigation of the bitter chait melon that they disagree. In other words, there was this investigation. Rabbi Yosei and the sages are in agreement that even the outer section has a bitter taste to some extent, but they're arguing whether that level of bitterness is enough to possibly render it inedible. And Rabbi Yosei is maintaining that the bitter taste is so slight that it will not render the outer portion inedible, and it's only the inner portion that's inedible. And the sages, on the other hand, are saying that this level of bitterness even comes to the outer section as well, and therefore they're saying that you have to replace it with a different melon. Anyway, we're going to get into other kinds of spoiled food tomorrow, like what happens if a snake bit the potential truma produce. Well, you can't serve somebody poisoned food, so that's what we're going to be dealing with tomorrow. Have a great day.